Can one aircraft do basically everything? Well, the C-130 Hercules, or the Herc as it's known to its friends, is primarily a military cargo aircraft, but it has also been used to carry paratroopers. It can land on dirt, ice or snow. It has snooped on people. It can refuel other planes and helicopters, fight fires and spray crops, chase hurricanes, and has performed all kinds of humanitarian and research work known to man. It has also landed on an aircraft carrier. It has dropped bombs, big and small, and it's even managed to recover spy satellites returning from space. So, how has one aircraft been able to do all of those things and kept going for so long? Because if you thought that the Boeing 737 has been in production for longer than any other aircraft, but then you're actually wrong. The C-130 entered service 12 years before the first 737 and has now been produced continuously for over 71 years. Nothing even comes close to that. In this video, we are going to look at how the C-130 became such a lasting success, which is made even more incredible considering that it almost didn't happen. You see, Lockheed's most celebrated aircraft engineer absolutely hated it. And finally, we're also going to look at if there is anything out there that could eventually replace it. Now, I will start this story by looking at a recent incident involving a C-130 that got a bit hairy and expensive, but serves as a great example of just how durable this aircraft is. On the 23rd of April in 2020, a US Air Force C-130J-30 was on approach to runway 26 in Ramstein Air Force Base in Germany. Now the weather was fine, although using that particular runway meant a 6-knot tailwind, which was by design. You see, the pilot sitting in the left seat on that day was being evaluated, and that check ride involves a number of different tasks, including flying formation with 2 other C-130s, and also something known as a maximum effort landing. A maximum effort or assault landing is a tactical landing, flown at slower speeds to enable the plane to stop in as short of a distance as possible. Now, there were quite a few complications in this approach, including that tailwind, and to put it mildly, it didn't go as planned. According to the accident report, the pilot started pulling back on the thrust levers a bit too early during the flare, at around 70 feet above the runway, bringing them back to the flight idle at around 45 feet. In normal conditions, that thrust reduction should have started at around 20 feet, so this was very early. Now, doing this is particularly bad in the C-130 because the prop wash is actually helping the wing generate lift during low speeds, enabling it to land as slowly as possible. Now, this didn't stall the plane, but it did cause a high sink rate, which both pilots were then too late to react to. The pilot sitting on the right seat called for a go-around when the aircraft was about 30 feet above the runway, and the pilot flying had at that point already started doing that by pushing the thrust levels forward and starting to pitch up. But like I said, it was still a bit late, and with the engines already at idle at that point, they now couldn't spool up fast enough to stop the plane from touching down hard. Now, a maximum effort landing is a fairly hard landing anyway, but every aircraft has a certain limit for this, and the C-130 is no exception from that. The maximum descent rate at touchdown that this plane should have had was based on its weight that day about 540 feet per minute, and the maximum load with the flaps extended was 2 Gs, or twice the force of gravity. In this case though, the plane touched down with a descent rate of approximately 834 feet per minute, giving it a peak instantaneous G-load of between 3.62 and 3.81 Gs. Now, despite this, the aircraft still went around before the nose wheel touched the ground, and initially, the crew briefed for another maximum effort landing in the opposite direction. But as they prepared for that, the pilots noticed the max G load of 3.7 and 3.8 Gs from their previous landing in their primary flight displays, which obviously made them change their plans. So instead, they now made a more docile, uneventful landing with full flaps, followed by a taxi into the parking area and them shutting down the engines. And had this not been a C-130 Hercules, that would likely have been the very last flight that this plane would ever have done. Because you see, the damage turned out to be pretty brutal. There was buckling in the skin on the underside of the airframe, and even worse than that, there were popped rivets and cracks all over the wing. In the weeks after the incident, maintenance crews and Lockheed Martin determined that the list of damaged parts included the main landing gear, the propellers, propeller gearboxes, spinners and other related parts on all 4 engines, as well as all wing sections. Now, on most aircraft, such an extensive shopping list of broken parts and components would simply be uneconomical to repair or replace, if it even would be possible. And yet, here is a photo of this same aircraft flying 5 years later. Now, to understand how this was even possible, we need to look at the design of the C-130 a bit more closely. And here we should also address a small misunderstanding about this aircraft. Kelly Johnson is one of the most prolific aircraft designers in the 20th century. Working for Lockheed, he designed many famous planes, starting with the Model 10 Electra, which was the plane that Amelia Earhart disappeared in. He also designed the P-38 fighter, the Constellation, the P-80, the T-33, the U-2 spy plane, the SR-71 and its many derivatives, as well as the F-104 among others. Quite a busy guy, in other words. But unlike what some sources suggest, Johnson did not design the C-130. And not only that, when he first took a look at the written specifications and at an early model of the plane, he turned to Lockheed's vice president and chief engineer at the time, Hal Hibbard, who had just gotten ready to send those specifications to the Air Force. And Johnson said, "Hibbard, if you sign that letter, you will destroy the Lockheed company." Now, Willis Hawkins, the engineer who led the design team behind the C-130, later explained this, saying that while Johnson was a genius, he wasn't impressed by a simple transport plane that didn't carry bombs, didn't have machine guns, and didn't fly at Mach 3. Also, every single plane Johnson designed looked sleek and fast, even when it was sitting still on the apron. And with all of the will in the world, you just can't say that about the Hercules. Now, Johnson eventually changed his mind about this plane, and there is a really simple and practical reason why the C-130 looks the way that it does. World War II and the Korean War that followed both showed the military that they really needed a medium-sized transport aircraft that could land on unprepared runways. Smaller aircraft with radial piston engines like the Douglas DC-3 or C-47 in military service could already do that, but the Air Force needed something bigger, with a ramp that would allow loading and unloading of cargo to be done much faster. Now, the C-130 wasn't the first plane to be able to land on bad terrain or have a ramp. Actually, it borrowed quite a lot of its features from an older design called the Fairchild C-123, which was quite successful in its own right, even though its design had actually started out as a glider. But the C-123 wasn't big enough to carry what the Air Force needed, and like every other transport plane at the time, it had piston engines, not turboprops. Thus, the Air Force drafted a requirement for a new, bigger transport aircraft, and the nature of this requirement meant that this new plane would literally have to be designed from the inside out. And crucially, the feature that would lead to the C-130's longevity came almost as an afterthought, which is quite astonishing, as you will soon see. Now, when we're talking about afterthoughts, that's also how we often treat our internet access, especially when we're traveling. It is just so easy to connect to unfamiliar free Wi-Fi networks in airport lounges, hotels and coffee shops, but every time that you do that, it's a potential security risk, especially when you're checking emails, accessing work files or logging into sensitive accounts. That was one of the main reasons why I started using today's sponsor, NordVPN, since they are the only VPN certified by independent cybersecurity experts and therefore perfect for providing the protection that I need. Their Threat Protection Pro feature checks websites before they even load on my devices, and if something looks sketchy, well then Nord will just block it. Nord also blocks trackers. Those are those little virtual spies that follow you around everywhere and gives you loads of ads for stuff that you maybe have searched for once. And that has also gotten way better after I started using Nord. Now obviously, I also use NordVPN for their fast connections to servers at home, which lets me access my favorite content. Like watching the Swedish Olympic team win gold in female curling when I was in Thailand a few weeks back. Anna Hasselborg in Team Hasselborg is actually the sister of my brother-in-law, so only being able to see her win was worth that Nord subscription. Now if you want to try this as well, then scan this QR code or head over to nordvpn.com/mentor now. That will give you 4 extra months for free when you sign up for their 2-year plan. And remember, Nord will always give you a 30-day money-back guarantee, so you don't risk anything by trying. Thank you, Nord. Now let's get back to the Herc. In its descriptions of the new transport plane that they wanted, the US Air Force didn't specify the dimensions of the aircraft itself. Instead, they provided a list of payloads involving vehicles and other pieces of equipment that the aircraft would need to be able to carry. Willis Hawkins, the plane's chief designer, explains what his team did in response. We basically took the dimensions of the biggest piece of equipment the Air Force had specified, drew a circle around its cross-section, and then turned the circle into a tube about the length of a railroad boxcar. We then put wings, a nose and a tail on it, and we had the design. It was basically that simple. Okay, there was a little bit more to it than that. The plane also needed very sturdy but low landing gear, so the ramp in the back wouldn't need to be so steep, and it was configured so that it wouldn't need any ground equipment to stay operational. Basically, as long as it has fuel in its tanks, it would start up and fly. The design then also had to be optimized for low speed, so at least when it entered service, its engines and propellers were set up to prioritize maximum thrust at low speeds instead of efficiency in cruise. Basically the opposite of how airliners are designed, sort of. But fundamentally, the C-130 was designed as a container with wings, with the room and the necessary weight capacity to handle quite a lot of equipment that the military was already familiar with. And that was the reason why this aircraft eventually became so successful. But more importantly, its size quickly became sort of a standard. After the C-130 had entered service, the US Army, and other armies for that matter, would issue requests for new equipment that would need to be air transportable in a C-130. And that led to the designs of some quite popular military vehicles, like the M113 Armored Personnel Carrier, for example. This standardization is a key reason why the C-130 was able to stay in demand for such a long time. It became the literal standard, similar to the containers that we see on roads and cargo ships today. Designers of a lot of newer military equipment then soon assumed that their products would have to fit into the C-130 as well, even if the specifications didn't say so. Pelletized equipment was then developed to fit the aircraft to cover everything from military to civilian research projects. Basically anything that involved getting to hard-to-reach places with no runways or to ease the fitting of bulky firefighting equipment. There is also a commercial version of the C-130 called the Lockheed L-100 Hercules, which has been made in a few different versions, although that hasn't been in continuous production like its military equivalent have. Now this feedback loop of specifications made the Hercules a kind of a do-anything aircraft. The US Air Force did try to replace it a few times. A project called the Advanced Medium S-Tool Transport, or AMST for example, was intended to replace the C-130 in the 1970s and 80s, but like other prospective replacement, it soon proved too costly or too complex for little extra benefit. Here it is worth adding that unlike the airline world, in the military, efficiency isn't everything. The Hercules is overbuilt anyway, with its nice, thick, low aspect ratio wing that is designed to maximize lift at low and medium speeds, so more modern designs, who promise to be more efficient and faster, might not seem as attractive as their designers assumed that they would do. Instead, what ended up happening was that various other designs were created who would end up supplementing the Hercules in Air Force services around the world by being either bigger or smaller. But there still is one more element in this story, which takes us back to that C-130 that made that heavy landing in Germany. How was it possible to even repair that aircraft? Now remember how the C-130's original designer described it? A container or boxcar with wings, a nose and a tail that can land in a battle zone? Well, the area that we need to concentrate on here is the point where the wings meet the fuselage. This is called the center wing box, and all big aircraft have a structure similar to it. In low-wing aircraft like the 737 that I fly, the wing box is where all of the loads from the wing and the landing gear meet the rest of the aircraft. High-wing aircraft are a little bit more complicated because the landing gear isn't attached directly to the wing box, which means that the fuselage section between the wings and the gear has to be sturdy enough to still be able to transfer those loads. And that is actually why high-wing designs generally tend to be a bit heavier than similar low-wing designs. But either way, in most cases, a center wing box is not a replaceable part in an aircraft. Even if such a replacement would be possible theoretically, you would essentially need to disassemble the whole aircraft to get to it, in most aircraft, but not the C-130. Now in the Hercules, the center wing box includes a section of the wing up to and including the mounts for the two inboard engines, which is mounted above the cabin. And crucially, the way that it is mounted there means that it can be replaced, which is a big deal. You see, the lifespan of most complex modern aircraft is limited by fatigue. And that fatigue can affect many areas, but usually the ones that limit an aircraft's lifespan involve either the compression and decompression cycles or wear on the wing and wing box. When an aircraft completes a specific number of flight cycles, flight hours or a combination of both, well then it's just retired and broken up. But in a beefy aircraft design like the Hercules, which doesn't cruise quite as high as most airliners do, it's the wing and wing box that would limit the plane's life, if it hadn't been replaceable. In the C-130, the center wing box is something called a lifed article. Those are critical components or systems that have operational limits specified in total flight hours, age, or both. In the case of the center wing box of the Hercules, most of the early variants of the plane had limits of around 19,000 flight hours, although that number depends on the type of flying that aircraft had been subjected to, and calculating this number properly is really critical. Back in 2002, a very early C-130 Alpha model used for firefighting crashed very dramatically and killed all 3 crew members on board when the wing box failed and the 2 wings folded upwards one after the other. Those earlier wings were weaker, and at the time of the accident there were some serious maintenance and operation-related issues with this specific aircraft. But another important factor was that aircraft used in firefighting roles are subjected to much higher stresses than planes just flying normal cargo. Something that hadn't been taken into account in the maintenance and inspection schedules of that aircraft. Now, in the newer C-130J, the original center wing boxes had a limit of 45,000 flying hours, up from 19,000 before. But more recently, Lockheed has introduced an enhanced service life, or ESL, center wing, initially estimated to be good for 90,000 hours, which is just crazy. And Lockheed now even says that the ESL wing actually has a proven lifespan of 122,500 hours. In any case, like with other lifed parts, once these center wing boxes are replaced, the life clock is reset on it, and the hours of flight cycles start counting up from 0 again. And that matters, because getting used in unusual roles like firefighting or chasing hurricanes would otherwise have quickly eaten up the available flight hours of many middle-aged C-130s. If it hadn't been possible to give them that new leaf of life with a new wing box, that is. Now to be clear here, replacing the wing box on a C-130 isn't an easy or cheap operation. But if the rest of the aircraft doesn't have any other fatigue-related issues or isn't so old that its systems and other components are too hard to maintain, well then it is a job worth doing. The total cost of a C-130 wing box replacement is a little bit hard to find and will also vary depending on where it's being done and by whom. But in 2007, the US Air Force priced the operation at $6.5 to $7 million, which is still only a small fraction of the cost of getting a new C-130. So if we go back to that C-130 that landed hard in Ramstein, Germany, this was an aircraft built in 2013, so it was relatively new. And even though that accident also required much more repairs and parts, including 4 rebuilt engines, the total cost of that operation was around $20.9 million. Not cheap, but a brand new C-130J30 would cost several times that amount. So now maybe you start to understand why this was done and how it was possible. But there was also an additional twist to that story. You see, there is one company that can perform such a wing replacement outside of the United States called the Marshall Group in Cambridge, UK. But the US Air Force themselves have only ever done this job inside of the United States. So for them to perform this field wing replacement in Germany, the Air Force first had to figure out how to pack up and ship a wing over there, and the job then also required quite a bit of precision, special jigs and other mechanisms. So all in all, pulling off this repair and all the other repairs that this Hercules needed, including the time needed to build the new wing and ship it across the pond, took over 5 years. Now, one question that we haven't been able to find out, none of us in the team, is whether or not the US Air Force actually intended for the wing box to be replaceable back when it was designed, or if this was just a lucky coincidence in the way that the C-130 was built. And if you guys know anything about this, please let us know in the comments below. Finally, there is also one more question that needs to be answered. Is there any other aircraft out there that could possibly replace the C-130 in the near future? Well, Airbus tried it with their A400M, which actually did win some orders, but not enough to really replace the C-130. Well, in most countries at least. But another possible candidate is the Embraer C390. This aircraft has a similar size and capacity as the C-130J30, and instead of 4 turboprops, it has 2 IAE V2500 turbofans. Those are the same engines used on many legacy Airbus A320s. Sales for this aircraft suffered badly at first, very likely because of the failed tie-up between Boeing and Embraer back in 2020, but in the last couple of years, Embraer has secured a lot more orders for the plane, so it is definitely one to look out for. As for the C-130, well, it's still in production, so don't dismiss it just yet. And even when no new ones are made anymore, the existing models will take a very long time to go out of style. As we saw in another video we did recently, Boeing's B-52s will very likely stay in service for over a century. But the B-52 was actually in production for only around a decade, and when the last one of them is retired, there will likely be a lot of C-130s still flying around, proving that you don't have to be fast or good looking to be cool. So what do you think? What is your favorite strange role that the C-130 has performed? Let us know in the comments below. Thank you all for watching, and I really hope that you have subscribed to the channel. Now, if you want to support my team and I, watch all of our videos before everyone else and join my next Zoom hangout, well then please scan this QR code or go to patreon.com/join/mentorpilot and sign up. My name is Peter Hörnfeldt and you're watching Mentor now. Have an absolutely fantastic day and I'll see you next time. Bye bye.